Before we begin this incredible journey, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our emotional stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Marcus stood at attention, his polished armor reflecting the golden light. He had dreamed of this moment since he was a boy watching the royal guards march through his village. Now at 25 years old, he was one of them, the youngest member of the king's royal guard, sworn to protect the throne with his life. Marcus came from nothing. His father was a blacksmith who died when Marcus was 12, leaving him and his mother to survive on whatever work they could find. His mother cleaned houses in the wealthy district, her hands rough and worn from years of labor. She never complained, never showed bitterness. Instead, she filled Marcus with stories of honor, courage, and the belief that a man's worth came from his character, not his birth. When the royal guard announced they were accepting new recruits, Marcus knew it was his chance. Hundreds of men applied, but only 5 would be chosen. The trials were brutal. Physical tests that pushed bodies to their limits, mental challenges that required quick thinking and strategy, and moral dilemmas that revealed a person's true nature. Marcus passed them all, driven by the memory of his father's strength and his mother's unwavering faith in him. Now, he stood beside men who came from noble families, who had trained in private academies since childhood. They looked at him differently. This blacksmith's son, who somehow earned his place among them. Some respected his achievement. Others resented it. Captain Aldrich, the commander of the guard, was hard to read. He was a mountain of a man with silver hair and a scar running down his left cheek, earned in the border wars 20 years ago. The palace was a world Marcus never imagined he would enter. Marble halls stretched endlessly, decorated with tapestries depicting centuries of royal history. Servants moved quietly through corridors, and nobles walked with an air of entitlement Marcus found unsettling. But his duty was clear: protect the king, maintain order, and uphold the honor of the guard. King Edward was in his 50s, a thoughtful ruler who had brought peace to the kingdom after years of conflict. He was loved by the common people, but faced constant pressure from the noble houses who wanted more power and influence. Marcus saw how the king carried this weight, the tired lines around his eyes, the careful way he spoke to ensure every word served a purpose. 3 months into his service, Marcus began to notice things. Small things at first. Conversations that stopped when he entered a room. Glances exchanged between certain guards that seemed to carry hidden meaning. Captain Aldrich spending long hours in private meetings with Lord Vance, the king's chief advisor. A man whose smile never reached his eyes. Marcus told himself he was imagining things, that his outsider status made him paranoid, but the feeling grew stronger. One evening, while standing guard outside the council chamber, he overheard fragments of a conversation. Lord Vance's voice, smooth as silk, talking about timing and opportunity. Another voice, which Marcus thought belonged to Sir Garrett, one of the senior guards, mentioning the northern border and a convenient distraction. His heart pounded as he strained to hear more. But footsteps approached and he snapped back to attention. A servant passed by, carrying a tray of wine. The moment was gone, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in his small room in the guards' quarters, staring at the ceiling. What had he heard? Was it innocent conversation taken out of context, or something darker? He thought about approaching Captain Aldrich, but what would he say? That he had vague suspicions based on whispers and feelings. He would sound like a fool, or worse, like someone trying to cause trouble to elevate himself. The next morning brought news that shook the palace. The king's younger brother, Prince Thomas, had been found dead in his chambers. The official word was that it was a heart condition, sudden and tragic. Prince Thomas was only 42, known for his robust health and love of hunting. The timing felt wrong to Marcus, especially after what he had overheard. The funeral was held with great ceremony. Marcus stood watch as nobles from across the kingdom came to pay their respects. He watched their faces, looking for signs of genuine grief or hidden satisfaction. Most seemed appropriately somber, but Lord Vance maintained that same controlled expression, revealing nothing. After the funeral, security around the king increased. More guards were posted at every entrance, and the king's movements were carefully controlled. Captain Aldrich gathered the guard and spoke about vigilance and duty. His words were proper and commanding, but Marcus detected something underneath. Attention, perhaps. Or was he still seeing shadows where none existed? Marcus decided to watch and listen. He volunteered for extra shifts, positioning himself where he might overhear useful information. He began to map out the relationships between the guards, noting who was friendly with whom, who had debts or family connections to powerful nobles. It was dangerous work. If he was wrong, he would destroy his career and possibly face charges of spreading false accusations. If he was right, he was walking into something that had already claimed one life. 2 weeks after the prince's death, Marcus was assigned to night duty in the East Wing, a quiet section of the palace rarely used except for storage and old records. It was considered an easy assignment, almost boring. But at midnight, Marcus heard something. Footsteps, deliberate and quiet, coming from the archive room. He moved silently toward the sound, his hand on his sword. Through the partially open door, he saw a figure in guard uniform searching through documents by candlelight. The figure turned slightly, and Marcus's blood ran cold. It was Sir Garrett, and the papers he held bore the royal seal. Marcus pressed himself against the wall, his breathing shallow and controlled. Sir Garrett was one of the most respected members of the Guard, a veteran of 15 years with commendations for bravery and loyalty. Seeing him secretly going through royal documents in the middle of the night confirmed Marcus's worst fears. Something was very wrong within the palace walls. Garrett rolled up the documents and tucked them inside his uniform. He extinguished the candle and moved toward the door. Marcus had seconds to decide. Confront him now, or follow and learn more. Training told him to raise the alarm immediately, but instinct whispered that he needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before making accusations against a decorated guard. Marcus slipped into a side corridor as Garrett emerged. He followed at a distance, using the shadows and his knowledge of the palace layout to stay hidden. Garrett moved with purpose through the East Wing, then descended a narrow staircase Marcus had never used before. The air grew colder and damper as they went deeper. These were the old servant passages. Built centuries ago when the palace was first constructed, the passage opened into a small, underground chamber lit by torches. Marcus positioned himself behind a stone pillar, his heart hammering in his chest. Garrett wasn't alone. 4 other guards were there, and to Marcus's shock, so was Captain Aldrich. They stood in a circle, their faces grim and serious. Captain Aldrich spoke first, his voice low and commanding. He talked about the plan moving forward, about the king's schedule for the coming week, about windows of opportunity. Sir Garrett handed over the documents he had stolen, and Aldrich studied them carefully. Another guard, Sir Devon, mentioned securing the North Gate and ensuring certain sentries would be on duty at specific times. Marcus felt sick. This was a conspiracy, and it reached the highest levels of the Guard. These men, sworn to protect the king, were plotting something terrible. He needed proof, needed to hear them say it clearly, but he also needed to survive long enough to warn someone who could be trusted. Lord. Vance entered the chamber through another passage, his expensive robes looking out of place in the rough stone room. He smiled that cold smile and congratulated Aldrich on his progress. They discussed the northern border situation, a skirmish that was apparently being manufactured to draw attention away from the capital. Vance mentioned that certain nobles were ready to support the transition of power, that the kingdom would be better served by new leadership. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. They were planning to kill the king. A coup, disguised as some kind of accident or natural event, with enough chaos at the borders to prevent immediate retaliation. Prince Thomas hadn't died of natural causes. He had been murdered because he was the king's brother and strongest ally. Marcus knew he had to leave, had to get this information to someone loyal to the king. But who? How many guards were involved? How deep did this conspiracy go? He began backing away carefully, his eyes still fixed on the meeting. His boots scraped against loose stone, sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet passage. Everyone in the chamber froze. Captain Aldrich's head snapped toward the entrance where Marcus was hidden. He barked an order, and Sir Garrett and Sir Devon moved toward the passages with weapons drawn. Marcus ran. He sprinted through the dark corridors, his knowledge of the palace layout the only advantage he had. Behind him, he heard pursuit, boots pounding on stone, voices calling for him to stop. He emerged into the main palace through a servant's entrance, startling a maid carrying linens. Marcus didn't stop. He ran toward the king's chambers, knowing that was the only place that might still be secure. Guards saw him running and called out, but he ignored them. He had to reach the king. 2 guards stood outside the royal chambers, men Marcus didn't recognize well. They crossed their spears as he approached, demanding to know what was happening. Marcus was breathing hard, trying to form words that would make them understand the urgency, without revealing too much to potential conspirators. Before he could speak, Captain Aldrich appeared at the end of the corridor with 6 guards. Aldrich's face was calm, but his eyes were ice. He spoke loudly, addressing the guards at the door and others who had gathered. He said that Marcus had been caught stealing from the archives, that he had attacked Sir Garrett when confronted, that he was trying to reach the king's chambers to complete some desperate plan. Marcus felt the world tilting. Aldrich was turning the truth inside out, making Marcus the criminal. The guards at the door looked uncertain, their spears still crossed but their confidence shaken. Marcus realized that his word, a new recruit from common birth, would never stand against Captain Aldrich's sterling reputation. He did the only thing he could. Marcus drew his sword and smashed the window beside the king's door with the pommel. The glass shattered loudly, and alarm bells began ringing throughout the palace. The noise would wake the king and bring more guards, creating chaos that might save his life for a few more minutes. The guards at the door grabbed him, forcing him to his knees. His sword clattered to the floor. Aldrich approached slowly, shaking his head as if disappointed by a promising student who had gone astray. He ordered Marcus be taken to the dungeon to await trial for treason, and attempted regicide as they dragged him away. Marcus saw the king's door open. King Edward stood there in his nightclothes, looking confused and concerned. Their eyes met for just a moment. Marcus tried to convey everything in that glance, tried to make the king see the truth. But then he was pulled around a corner. The king disappeared from view. The dungeon was exactly as Marcus had imagined from childhood stories. Cold, dark, smelling of dampness and despair. They threw him into a cell and locked the heavy door. Marcus sat on the rough stone bench, his mind racing. He had failed. The conspiracy would continue, and the king would die without ever knowing the danger he faced. Hours passed. No one came. Marcus wondered if this was how it would end, if he would simply disappear like so many prisoners before him. His mother would never know what happened to her son, would believe he had somehow become the criminal Aldrich claimed. Then he heard footsteps, lighter than a guard's heavy boots. A figure appeared at his cell door, who'd drawn up to hide their face. They held up a key and whispered urgently that he had one friend left in the palace. Someone who believed him and knew the truth about what was happening in the shadows. The cell door swung open with a creak that seemed impossibly loud. The hooded figure gestured urgently for Marcus to follow. Every instinct screamed that this could be a trap, another layer of the conspiracy designed to implicate him further or simply execute him away from witnesses. But staying in the cell guaranteed death or worse. So Marcus stepped into the corridor. They moved quickly through the dungeon's maze of passages. The figure was small and moved with practiced grace, clearly familiar with these tunnels. When they reached a junction where a torchlight from the guard station spilled across the stones, the figure finally pulled back their hood. Marcus gasped. It was Princess Alina, the king's only daughter. Alina was 19, known throughout the kingdom for her intelligence and independence. Unlike many royal daughters who focused solely on courtly arts, she had insisted on studying history, strategy, and statecraft alongside her martial training. The king had indulged her, perhaps seeing in her some of the fire that had made him a strong ruler. She pressed a finger to her lips and led Marcus through a hidden door that opened into the palace's forgotten maintenance tunnels. Only when they were safely away from the dungeon did she speak. Her voice was steady but urgent. She had suspected something was wrong for weeks, had noticed the same strange behaviors Marcus had observed. When he was arrested, she knew it was connected to whatever conspiracy was unfolding. Marcus quickly told her everything he had witnessed in the underground chamber. Elena's face grew pale as she listened, but she didn't interrupt or question his credibility. When he finished, she nodded grimly. Her father was in terrible danger. They had very little time to act. The princess explained that she had been conducting her own quiet investigation. Her position gave her access to people and places that guards couldn't reach. She had noticed that her father's chief physician, Dr. Hollis, had been acting strangely, preparing special tonics and medicines that the king had started taking regularly since Prince Thomas died. Elena suspected the doctor was slowly poisoning her father, weakening him for whatever final blow the conspirators planned. She had also discovered that the northern border skirmish was scheduled to escalate in 3 days. Lord Vance had been sending secret messages to a mercenary commander, paying him to create a crisis that would demand the king's attention and military response. During the chaos, Aldrich and his men planned to eliminate the king and blame it on enemy assassins who had infiltrated the palace. Marcus felt the weight of this knowledge crushing down on him. They were just 2 people against a conspiracy that included the captain of the guard,
the king's most trusted advisor,
and who knew how many others. Even if they went to the king with their evidence, would he believe them over men he had trusted for years? Elena had thought of this. She led Marcus to her private chambers, a risk since guards loyal to Aldrich could be watching, but necessary. Inside, she opened a hidden compartment in her desk and pulled out letters, documents, and a small vial. The documents were financial records showing payments from Lord Vance to various guards and nobles, evidence of the conspiracy's scope. The letters were correspondence between Vance and the mercenary commander. The vial contained a sample of the medicine her father was taking, which Elena had secretly given to a herbalist she trusted. The herbalist confirmed it contained a slow-acting poison. This was real evidence, proof that even the most loyal supporter of Aldrich and Vance couldn't dismiss. But getting it to the king was still nearly impossible. The palace was effectively controlled by the conspirators. Every guard station, every entrance to the royal chambers, was manned by men who answered to Aldrich. Marcus suggested they flee the palace and seek help from the royal army, whose commanders were stationed outside the capital. Elena shook her head. By the time they reached the army and convinced them to act, the king would be dead. They had to act now, tonight, while there was still a chance. A desperate plan began to form. The king had a private council meeting scheduled for dawn with his remaining trusted advisors. Lord Vance would be there, as would Captain Aldrich, supposedly to report on palace security. It was likely the moment they planned to strike, when the king was in a confined space with limited guards. But it was also an opportunity. Elena could attend the meeting, as was her right as the king's daughter and heir. She could bring the evidence and expose the conspiracy in front of witnesses who were not part of the plot. The risk was enormous. If any of the other attendees were conspirators, or if Aldrich simply chose to act violently, both Elena and her father could be killed on the spot. They needed insurance, something to tip the balance in their favor. Marcus had an idea. Among the palace guards, there were men he believed were genuinely loyal, guards who had shown integrity and honor in their daily duties. If he could reach them, explain the situation, and convince them to act, they might have enough force to counter Aldrich's men. The problem was identifying who could truly be trusted. Marcus thought of Sir Brennan, an older guard who had been kind to him when he first joined, who often spoke about duty and honor in ways that seemed genuine. There was young Thomas Fletcher, barely a year ahead of Marcus in service, whose family had served the crown for generations. And Helena Vance, no relation to the treacherous lord, who had earned her place through exceptional skill and who Marcus had seen stand up to bullying from senior guards. Elena gave Marcus a royal seal, something that would prove he acted with her authority. It was an incredible risk. If he was caught using the princess's seal, it would implicate her in what Aldrich would call treason. But they were far beyond safe choices now. Marcus slipped back into the palace proper through the hidden passages Elena showed him. The night was growing short and dawn would come in a few hours. He made his way to the guards' quarters, moving like a ghost through corridors he had walked confidently just days before. Sir Brennan was in his small private room, awake and reading by candlelight. When Marcus appeared in his doorway, the older guard reached for his weapon. Marcus quickly showed the princess's seal and begged for a chance to explain. Something in his voice or face must have reached Brennan. Because the old guard lowered his sword and listened, Marcus told him everything. As he spoke, he watched Brennan's face shift from skepticism to horror to anger. When Marcus finished, Brennan sat heavily on his bed, looking older than his 50 years. He had served under Aldrich for a decade, had considered him a friend. The betrayal cut deep, but Brennan was a soldier first, and soldiers protected the innocent and upheld their oaths. He agreed to help. Together, they woke Thomas Fletcher and Helena Vance, taking the same risk with each. Fletcher was shocked, but quickly pledged his support. Helena listened with a warrior's focus and immediately began planning tactical positions and contingencies. They had 4 loyal guards against potentially dozens of conspirators. The odds were terrible, but they had truth and desperation on their side. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, they prepared for a confrontation that would determine not just their fates, but the fate of the entire kingdom. The council chamber was in the oldest part of the palace, a circular room with tall windows that overlooked the eastern gardens. King Edward preferred it for private meetings because the morning light filled the space with warmth, and the thick stone walls kept conversations secure. This morning that security would work against him. Princess Alina entered first, as was proper. She wore a formal gown but had insisted on a design that allowed freedom of movement. Hidden in the folds of her dress were the documents that could expose the conspiracy. Her face was composed, showing none of the fear that raced through her heart. King Edward was already seated, looking tired but alert. His personal secretary, an elderly man named Weston, who had served the crown for 40 years, sat nearby with parchment ready to record the meeting. 2 other advisors were present: Lord Marshal Hendrick, who commanded the city garrison, and Treasury Minister Clifton, who managed the kingdom's finances. Both men had reputations for loyalty and competence. Lord Vance arrived next, his smile charming as always. He greeted the king warmly, asked after his health with what seemed like genuine concern. Captain Aldrich followed, his armor polished to perfection, the image of a dedicated protector. 6 guards stood at attention around the room's perimeter, and Marcus's heart sank as he recognized 5 of them from the underground meeting. The 6th was a young guard named Peter, who looked nervous and kept glancing at the others. Marcus, Brennan, Fletcher, and Helena were positioned just outside the main doors, officially there as additional security. They had debated whether Marcus should reveal himself or stay hidden, and decided that surprise might be their only advantage. Most people believed Marcus was still locked in the dungeon. Inside the chamber, King Edward called the meeting to order. He wanted to discuss the northern border situation and the concerning reports of increased mercenary activity. Lord Vance immediately took control, painting a picture of imminent invasion that required moving significant forces north, leaving the capital with reduced protection. It was smooth and convincing, and the king listened with the careful attention he gave all serious matters. Captain Aldrich supported Vance's assessment, adding that palace security would need to be restructured to compensate for the reduced garrison. He suggested moving most of the loyal senior guards to field positions, replacing them with newer recruits who would answer directly to him. The trap was being set in real time. Alina waited for her moment. When her father asked for other perspectives, she stood. Her voice was clear and strong as she addressed the room. She said she had information that directly contradicted Lord Vance's assessment. Evidence that the border crisis was manufactured and that there was a conspiracy within the palace itself. The room went silent. Lord Vance's smile never wavered, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Aldrich's hand moved subtly toward his sword. The king looked shocked, then concerned for his daughter. Worried she had been misled or was unwell from stress, Alina produced the documents one by one. The financial records showing Vance's payments, the letters to the mercenary commander, the analysis of the poisoned medicine. She laid them before her father and stepped back. King Edward picked up the first document, and his face began to change as he read. Lord Vance moved quickly. He snapped his fingers, and the 5 conspirator guards drew their weapons. Aldrich shouted that the princess had been corrupted by the traitor Marcus, that this was all part of a plot to seize power. He called for Alina to be restrained, and for the king to be moved to safety, which really meant moved into their complete control. The doors burst open. Marcus, Brennan, Fletcher, and Helena charged in with weapons ready. The young guard Peter, who had been wavering in his loyalty, suddenly understood what was really happening and turned his sword against the conspirators. 6 against 5 now, but the king was in the middle, and any fight risked his life. King Edward rose to his feet, and his voice cut through the chaos. He was not a warrior king by nature, but he had commanded armies in his youth, and that authority returned now. He ordered everyone to lower their weapons and speak truth. For a moment, the room hung in balance. Aldrich made his choice. He lunged for the king with a speed that belied his age, his sword aimed for Edward's heart. Marcus was faster. He threw himself between them, his own blade deflecting Aldrich's strike. The sound of steel on steel shattered the momentary peace, and the room erupted into violence. Brennan engaged 2 conspirators at once, his experience and skill keeping them at bay. Fletcher and Helena worked together, their movements coordinated from training sessions where they had often been paired. Peter fought with the desperation of a man trying to redeem himself, holding off another conspirator. Alina grabbed her father and pulled him toward the wall, away from the fighting. Marcus and Aldrich circled each other. The captain was a superior swordsman with decades of experience. Marcus was younger and faster, but outmatched in technique. Aldrich struck with precise, powerful blows that drove Marcus backward. He taunted Marcus, called him a peasant playing at being a knight, promised him a painful death. Lord Vance had drawn a concealed dagger and was moving toward Alina and the king. Alina saw him coming and pushed her father behind her, grabbing a ceremonial sword from the wall display. She had trained in combat, but Vance fought dirty, going for her legs and using his free hand to throw the meeting table's contents at her lord. Marshal Hendrick and Minister Clifton had initially frozen in shock, but seeing their king threatened broke their paralysis. Hendrick, though past his prime, was still a trained soldier. He tackled Vance from the side, and they crashed into the windows. Glass shattered, and both men grappled dangerously close to the edge. Secretary Weston, elderly and unarmed, did the bravest thing Marcus ever witnessed. He threw himself at one of the conspirator guards who was about to strike Helena from behind.
Amos.
Unwi-fi'd. The guard's sword pierced Weston's chest, but the delay allowed Helena to turn and counter. Disarming the killer with a swift combination, Marcus felt his strength fading. Aldrich was too skilled, and each exchange left Marcus with new cuts and bruises. The captain saw victory approaching and pressed his advantage. He spoke of how the kingdom would be better under new leadership, how weak kings led to weak nations, how power should be taken by those strong enough to hold it. Something in those words sparked a memory. Marcus thought of his mother, her strength not in violence but in endurance and love. He thought of his father, whose strength came from creating rather than destroying. He realized that Aldrich understood only one kind of power, and that limitation was his weakness. Marcus changed tactics. Instead of meeting force with force, he gave way, using Aldrich's momentum against him. The captain stumbled forward, expecting resistance that wasn't there. In that moment of imbalance, Marcus struck low and fast, cutting deep into Aldrich's sword arm. The captain's weapon fell, and Marcus's blade came to rest against his throat. Around the room the tide had turned. The conspirator guards were dead or disarmed. Lord Vance hung halfway out the broken window, held only by Hendrik's grip on his collar. The Lord Marshal hauled him back in and threw him to the floor. It was over. King Edward stood amid the wreckage of his council chamber, looking at men he had trusted and realizing how close he had come to death. He looked at his daughter, standing fierce and unbroken. He looked at Marcus, a young guard he barely knew, who had saved his life. The truth of the conspiracy was undeniable now, written in blood and broken glass, and the evidence scattered across the floor. The aftermath of the battle was chaos controlled by necessity. King Edward immediately ordered the palace sealed, no one entering or leaving until every conspirator was identified and secured. Lord Marshal Hendrik took command of the city garrison, bringing in soldiers loyal to the crown to replace the compromised palace guards. Captain Aldrich and Lord Vance were dragged to the dungeons. Along with the surviving conspirators, Marcus stood in the council chamber, his sword still in hand, unable to quite believe they had survived. His body ached from a dozen wounds, none serious but all painful reminders of how close they had come to failure. Helena was tending to young Peter, who had taken a deep cut across his shoulder. Fletcher stood guard at the door, trusting no one until the loyal garrison soldiers arrived. Sir Brennan knelt beside Secretary Weston's body, closing the old man's eyes with a warrior's respect for the fallen. Princess Elena sat with her father, both of them trying to process the betrayal they had just survived. The king looked older somehow, the weight of nearly dying at the hands of men he trusted adding years to his face. But there was also something new in his expression, a hardness, a resolution that had been tested and proven unbreakable. When the garrison soldiers secured the palace, the real work began. Under Elena's direction, they systematically investigated every member of the palace staff and guard. The documents she had gathered provided names, but there were others involved whose identities were less clear. Some conspirators tried to flee and were caught at the gates. Others attempted to destroy evidence, or turn on their fellow plotters in hopes of mercy. The interrogations revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. It had been years in the making. Lord Vance had carefully cultivated relationships with ambitious nobles, who resented King Edward's reforms that limited their power. Captain Aldrich had been recruited through a combination of gold and promises of greater authority. The plan had always been to eliminate the king and his brother, then place a puppet ruler on the throne that Vance could control. The northern border crisis was meant to be the perfect distraction, with mercenaries causing enough trouble to justify military intervention while the real attack happened at home. Prince Thomas had discovered part of the plot shortly before his death. He had confronted Dr. Hollis about the suspicious medicines being prepared for the king. Hollis, terrified and in over his head, had reported this to Vance. Within a day, the prince was dead, poisoned by the very doctor he had tried to expose. Hollis confessed this through tears, claiming he never wanted to be part of murder, but had been threatened and paid until he was too compromised to back out. The kingdom stood at a crossroads. The conspiracy had involved powerful nobles, and simply executing them all could spark civil war. Some advisors suggested showing mercy, offering exile instead of death. But King Edward had seen what mercy for traitors accomplished. It bred more treason. Justice had to be clear and uncompromising. Trials were held in the Great Hall, open to the public so everyone could hear the evidence and see justice served. Lord Vance showed no remorse, arguing until the end that he had acted for the kingdom's good, that King Edward's peaceful policies made them weak. Captain Aldrich remained silent, his warrior's pride refusing to beg or justify. Dr. Hollis wept and confessed everything, though it earned him no leniency. All three were sentenced to death for treason and murder. The executions were carried out at dawn in the palace courtyard. Marcus was required to attend as part of the guard, standing witness to the price of betrayal. He felt no satisfaction watching the men die, only a hollow awareness that their choices had led them there. Lives wasted on ambition and greed when they could have served something greater. In the weeks that followed, King Edward began rebuilding his guard and government. Every position was carefully filled with people whose loyalty was beyond question. The northern mercenaries, learning that their employer was dead and payment would not be coming, dispersed without further conflict. The nobles, who had been part of the conspiracy but had not directly participated in violence, were stripped of lands and titles, sent into exile with a warning that any return would mean death. Marcus found himself in an unexpected position. The king called him to a private audience and thanked him for his courage and loyalty. Edward spoke honestly about how difficult it was to trust anyone now, how every smile seemed potentially false, every word possibly hiding daggers. But he trusted Marcus because the young guard had risked everything when he had nothing to gain personally. The king asked Marcus to become his personal bodyguard, to be among the small group of people allowed closest to the royal family. It was an incredible honor, one that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Marcus accepted, knowing it was also an enormous responsibility. The king's life would be in his hands every day. Princess Elena's role also changed. She had proven herself not just as a royal daughter, but as a leader and strategist. The king began including her in all major decisions, preparing her to eventually rule. She worked closely with Marcus and the reformed guard. Her sharp mind, helping to design new security protocols that would prevent another conspiracy from taking root. Marcus's mother was brought to the palace when she learned what had happened to her son. She had believed the official story that he was arrested for treason and had spent days praying and weeping, certain she would lose him as she had lost his father. When Marcus explained the truth and showed her his new position, she could barely speak. She touched his face like he was still her little boy and told him she always knew. He was destined for great things. The king granted her an apartment in the palace and a pension, ensuring she would never have to clean houses or worry about survival again. It was a kindness that meant more to Marcus than any honor or title. His mother had sacrificed everything for him, and now he could finally give something back. Sir Brennan became the new captain of the guard. He accepted the position reluctantly, aware of the irony that he stepped into the role of the man who had betrayed them all. But Brennan was everything Aldrich had pretended to be: honorable, capable, and genuinely dedicated to protecting those under his care. Helena was promoted to lieutenant, her skill and courage earning respect from guards who might have dismissed her gender in another time. Thomas Fletcher and young Peter became squad leaders, their loyalty tested in fire and proven true. Life in the palace found a new rhythm. There was more caution now, more awareness that safety was never guaranteed. But there was also a sense of unity among those who had survived the conspiracy. They had faced darkness together and emerged into light, bound by shared struggle and the knowledge that they had done something that mattered. Marcus stood guard outside the king's chambers one evening, his usual post now. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He thought about how different his life was from a year ago, when he was just a blacksmith's son hoping to earn a place in the guard. He thought about the choices that had led him here, the moments when he could have looked away or stayed silent, but instead chose to act. Princess Elena passed by, turning from a strategy meeting. She paused and smiled at him, a genuine smile that carried friendship and respect. They had become close through the crisis to outsiders who had saved the kingdom. She asked if he was well, and he assured her he was. They spoke briefly about nothing important, just the comfortable conversation of people who trusted each other completely. After she left, Marcus returned to his thoughts. The battle had changed everything, but it had also revealed something important. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Honor was not following orders blindly, but standing for what was right, even when it cost everything. And loyalty was not just an oath spoken in ceremony, but a commitment proven through sacrifice. 6 months passed since the day the conspiracy was shattered. The kingdom had settled into a cautious peace, still healing from the revelation that treachery had reached so deep into the palace walls. King Edward had aged visibly, the lines around his eyes deeper, but there was also a new strength in him. Surviving an assassination attempt had either broken him or forged him into something stronger. He had chosen strength. Marcus had become something of a legend among the common people. Stories spread through the capital about the blacksmith's son who saved the king, each retelling adding details until some versions barely resembled the truth. Marcus found the attention uncomfortable. He was just doing his duty, nothing more. But he understood that people needed heroes, especially after learning how close they had come to losing their king and descending into civil war. The palace had become a different place. The reforms King Edward implemented made it harder for conspiracies to take root. No single person controlled too much power. Information was shared among multiple advisors who checked each other's work. The guard rotated positions frequently so no one could build a personal power base. It was not perfect, but it was better. On a spring morning, Marcus was called to the throne room for an official ceremony. He arrived to find it filled with nobles, guards, and citizens who had been granted entrance for the occasion. His mother sat in a place of honor, wearing a dress the princess had given her. Tears already streaming down her face, though nothing had happened yet. King Edward stood before his throne, Princess Elena at his right hand. The symbolism was clear. She was his heir and partner in rule now, no longer just a daughter to be married off for political advantage. Beside them stood Sir Brennan, Helena Thomas Fletcher, and young Peter. All of them wore their finest uniforms, medals gleaming on their chests. The king called Marcus forward. As he walked through the crowd, he remembered the first time he had entered this room as a new recruit. How overwhelming and impossible it had all seemed. He had been so young then, so uncertain of his place in this world. Now, he walked with confidence. Not from arrogance, but from the knowledge that he had been tested and had not broken. King Edward spoke to the assembled crowd about the conspiracy, and how it had nearly destroyed the kingdom. He did not hide the truth or soften it. The people deserved to know how close they had come to disaster. He spoke about the guards and individuals who had risked everything to expose the truth and save his life. Then he turned to Marcus. The king said that in every generation, certain people emerge who define the character of their time. These were not always the people born to power or privilege. Sometimes they were blacksmiths' sons who understood honor better than lords raised on it. Sometimes they were those who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, but acted anyway because it was right. King Edward drew his sword, and Marcus knelt. The blade touched his shoulders as the king spoke the ancient words of knighthood. Marcus was no longer just a guard. He was Sir Marcus, a knight of the realm with lands, title, and the right to bear arms in the king's name. It was an honor usually reserved for nobles or warriors who had served for decades. When Marcus stood, the throne room erupted in applause. His mother was weeping openly, and even Sir Brennan had tears in his eyes. Princess Elena smiled with genuine happiness, proud of her friend and ally. Marcus felt overwhelmed, humbled by the trust being placed in him. But the ceremony was not finished. The king also knighted Helena, recognizing her skill and courage in a traditionally male role. She became Dame Helena, the first woman in 3 generations to receive the honor. Thomas Fletcher and Peter were promoted to commander positions. Leading the reformed palace guard under Sir Brennan's oversight, there was a feast afterward. The kind of celebration the kingdom needed. Music played, wine flowed. For a few hours, people allowed themselves to forget the darkness and remember that they had survived. Marcus found himself surrounded by well-wishers, nobles who wanted to befriend him, and common people who saw him as one of their own who had risen. Through the crowd, he saw a man standing alone, watching him. The man was middle-aged, wearing simple traveling clothes that marked him as neither noble nor poor. Their eyes met, and the man nodded slightly before turning to leave. Something about him made Marcus excuse himself and follow. He caught up to the man in one of the palace gardens, away from the celebration. The man introduced himself as William, a merchant from the northern provinces. He had information that Marcus needed to hear privately. Marcus's hand went instinctively to his sword. Wondering if this was some new threat, William explained that he had been traveling the kingdom on business and had heard troubling reports. The nobles who were exiled after the conspiracy had not gone quietly into obscurity. They had settled in a neighboring kingdom and were building alliances, spreading lies about King Edward, claiming he was a tyrant who had killed innocent men. They were positioning for another attempt at power, this time from outside the kingdom's borders. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Of course, it was not over. Evil rarely died with one battle. It adapted, moved, and found new forms. He asked William why he was sharing this information, why he cared. The merchant smiled sadly and said his brother had been a palace guard who died in the fighting. One of the men who had been blackmailed into joining the conspiracy and could not escape. William wanted to ensure his brother's death meant something, that the kingdom stayed safe. Marcus thanked him and promised to bring this information to the king. As William left, Marcus stood in the garden, looking back at the palace lit up with celebration. There would be more challenges ahead, more threats to face. The conspiracy had been defeated but not destroyed. Its remnants festered beyond their borders, plotting revenge or restoration. But Marcus was not the uncertain young recruit anymore. He was a knight, surrounded by allies, serving a king worth protecting and a kingdom worth defending. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same courage that had brought him this far. He returned to the celebration and found Princess Alina speaking with a group of visiting diplomats. When she saw him, she excused herself and came over. She could read the concern on his face and asked what was wrong. Marcus told her about William's warning. Alina listened carefully, then suggested they inform her father after the celebration ended. There was time to plan and prepare. Tonight was for acknowledging what they had accomplished and drawing strength from it. Tomorrow they would face the new threats together as they had faced the last one. Marcus agreed. He found his mother in the crowd and spent time with her, listening to her talk about her simple life and how surreal all this seemed. She was still the same woman who had raised him with love and sacrifice, unbowed by tragedy, grateful for blessings. She told him she was proud, not of his title or position, but of the man he had become. That meant more than any knighthood. As the night grew late and the celebration wound down, Marcus took his post outside the king's chambers. It was his duty, his purpose, the thing that gave his life meaning. He was a guard, a knight, a protector of something greater than himself. The palace grew quiet. Stars appeared in the sky beyond the windows. Marcus stood at attention, his armor comfortable from long wear, his sword ready but unstressed. He thought about his journey from the smithy where his father worked to this corridor where he guarded a king. He thought about the choices that defined him, the battles won and lost, the friends made and the enemies defeated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be threats from beyond the borders, political intrigues to navigate, and the constant work of maintaining peace in a world that tended toward chaos. But tonight, Marcus stood his post with quiet satisfaction. He had done something that mattered. He had been tested by unseen trials and emerged victorious. He had saved a kingdom not through destiny or prophecy, but through simple courage and unwavering commitment to doing right. And that, he realized, was enough. That was everything. The young blacksmith's son had become a knight, not through birthright but through character. The royal guard had faced unseen trials and discovered that honor was not given but earned. The battle had changed everything, revealing both the darkness that could lurk in trusted hearts and the light that shone in unexpected souls. Marcus took a deep breath and settled into his stance. Whatever came next, he would face it the same way he had faced everything else, with courage, with honor, and with the absolute certainty that some things were worth fighting for. The kingdom was safe tonight. Tomorrow would take care of itself. For now, that was enough.